Okay guys, so this is chapter 21, plant responses and reproduction. So plant hormones are responsible for many of the quote-unquote behaviors of a plant. Basically what they do is they're able to allow the plant to make certain changes or reactions to their environment depending on whatever it is that they're facing. So make sure you know the 5 commonly recognized groups here. They're going to be pretty important. We're going to go through them just now, but these are the main ones here. Okay, so make sure you're clear on those. And so beginning with auxin, we notice that there's going to be some behaviors that plants have to do, mainly with light. They need to be able to get to the light so that they can photosynthesize. And you may have noticed before that plants will tend to bend towards light. Okay, that is called phototropism. Okay, so whenever you have heard of or seen a plant move towards light, that is called phototropism. So when you see that, make sure you know what that term is. We'll hear it again later on in the PowerPoint, but that's an important one. And the idea is that there's a hormone called auxin. Okay, that auxin hormone, it allows the shady side of the plant to elongate and get somewhat softer. What that does is it allows for the plant to be able to bend towards that light. It's also important when it comes to apical dominance. That's an important term as well. We'll talk about what that means in just a second. And also, when whenever you purchase a root stimulant, okay, that is because it has the hormone auxin. So these are important terms to understand. Here's what it looks like in phototropism. So you've got the one side of the plant that's on the light side, one that's on the dark side, and what happens is the auxin then penetrates to the side where there is going to be darkness. Okay, and what that does is it allows for the cells there to become softer. They weaken and they're able to bend. You don't want it to happen to the light side, because if it happens to the light side, then it'll just move towards the light and fall over. So this side stays rigid over here, whereas this side gets to have that auxin, which softens it quite a bit. And that's what happens here. This is done through movement of water. The water carries with it that auxin, and that auxin then weakens the cell wall. So the other thing that auxin does is it's important for apical dominance. So most plants will grow up, right? They will grow tall because they're apical meristems. Okay, and so what happens with these is their terminal bud is at the top, and when the terminal bud is removed, what happens is the lateral branches start to develop more because the auxin has nowhere to go, and the plant becomes bushier. Also, we've been able to remove the auxin from plants, and if you take a leaf cutting, like if you take the edge of a leaf at a node, what it does is it now is able to use that as a method of stimulation. So you put that in water with the red hormone, which is auxin, and it stimulates roots. Here's what this looks like when you have apical dominance. So the idea is the terminal bud is up at the top, so that makes the plants grow up, right? Now, this doesn't always work out this way. Sometimes the terminal bud gets removed, it's chopped off, and then the auxin has nowhere to go, so it causes the plant then to grow outwardly. Okay, that outward growth, okay, that allows it to get bushier and wider instead of taller. So the plant's still growing and it's still producing the auxin. It's just moving in a different direction for the plant. Okay, another hormone is the gibberellins. Okay, the common one is GA3 or gibberellic acid. This one's all about the leaves and roots and embryos and fruits. Okay, so what that does is it's a hormone that provides for the elongation and the growth of cells. A lot of the times, the most obvious thing you're going to see it is when it makes the plant grow taller between the nodes. So the auxin itself is for the growth up or to the sides. The gibberellins are responsible for the stem growth in between those nodes of leaves where they're growing. Okay. The other thing it's responsible for is dormancy. If a plant is not going to have favorable conditions, it goes into a dormancy state where it just kind of flatlines in growth, but that can be broken by gibberellins, and it can also start seed germination. So as you can see here, these plants have grown taller because of that gibberellin in there. So that's what that section is there for. So in between the nodes of leaf to flower or leaf to leaf, that's what's growing up. Another important one is cytokinin. Okay, cytokinin is all about the plant growth through cell division. So this is basically allowing it to get bigger and to grow more of its tissues. Now, what happens a lot is plants end up having to fight off aging quite a bit, right? They're dealing with sunlight, and so cytokinin ends up preventing that senescence or aging. So that whenever you see the word senescence, that's what that means. Senescence is just a fancy term for aging, and so that helps us helps the plant not get older. And when that level drops, the plant organs will stop growing or slow down significantly. So now to form the right organs in tissue culture, like we'll talk about this at the end of the PowerPoint some, but one of the things that we do is we try to grow leaves and roots and stems from tissue culture. Well, we have to make sure that the ratio of auxin and cytokinin is at a good point, because if the ratio is off, right, if you don't have the right amount, then you're going to end up not having the right organ or any organs form at all. And then another one is abscisic acid. Okay, this is a stress hormone. Basically, it allows for the plant to either go into dormancy at the buds or close its stomata. So this happens a lot in cold plants and plants that have to deal with extreme cold and winter. So let me show you what that looks like. So if you look at it here, both of these plants have a terminal bud. That's the part where they're growing. Okay. Now in this case, the spring twig, that terminal bud is uncovered. It's able to grow, so it is growing taller. The lateral buds are also able to grow as well. And then you have here what's called a terminal bud scar. That's from a previous winter. Well, during the winter, do you see how it's gotten kind of scaly and not really open to growth? Same thing here with the lateral bud. That's scaly and covered up, right? Those sections are because the abscisic acid has allowed the buds to stop growing, and now they're protecting themselves against water loss and extreme temperature and things like that. So, because even though in the winter you end up with lots of snow in some places, you do not end up with much water. And so the other thing abscisic acid does, like on a daily basis, is not so much the winter and spring twigs, but it is responsible for the closure of the stoma or the stomata. Okay, so what happens is you've got here these potassium ions, K+. Okay, the K+ is leaving the cell, okay, with the water, and those guard cells are now kind of shriveling up. So what happens is they close. So now you've got a closed stoma, and you're no longer going to have any more water loss. So that's one of the benefits of having abscisic acid. Finally, we have ethylene. Okay, the idea here is you have one plant in this one where there's no abscission, right? All the plants leaves and berries are attached. Excuse me. And then over here, you've got your leaves having fallen and your berries drooping or fallen completely. The only addition was they put in another fruit. Okay, so this is a gas that moves through the air and causes the fruit to ripen, and it ends up causing the leaf, the fruit, and the flower to drop. Okay, this is a natural gas that's being produced by the plants, and so we've used this for hundreds of years. Back before we were able to use or create the proper gases that we needed, we had these things called kerosene stoves. And the kerosene stove would be used to ripen the fruit because you'd have ethylene being produced. Now, you've heard the phrase, I'm sure, one rotten apple spoils the whole bunch. Well, that's because that one apple, like in this case right here, that one was releasing the gas that caused the ripening, and that's why the rest of these berries and leaves fell off. So we use this commercially now to artificially ripen fruit before it gets to market. So sometimes they end up having to pick things early because of a bad weather situation or something going on like that. Well, what they'll do is they'll save the fruit or the product, and then through the use of ethylene gas, they'll gas the fruit, and that will then cause it to ripen when they need it, so they can still continue to go to market even if they don't have the proper ripened fruit, because they can just ripen it on their own. And so here's kind of a quick table so you can understand that. It's a really good one to look at. This is in your textbook, but please make sure you know the 5 different hormones. These are very important to know, and again, their functions as well as where they're going to be found in the plant. Right? Most of these you find them in the meristems and the apical meristems. Cystic acid is going to be in the endosperms and the chloroplasts, and then ethylene is going to be typically in the apical meristem or the nodes. So. Now, for plant responses, we mentioned one a bit ago on phototropism, but there are others. We have positive tropism and negative tropism. Basically, positive tropism does not mean that it's growing up. It just means that it's growing towards a stimuli. So that doesn't necessarily mean up. Negative does not necessarily mean down. It just means away from the stimulus. Okay. So phototropism, that's where there's a response to light, where the plant actually moves towards the light. Okay. Gravitropism, you can have some that move towards gravity, some parts of the plant, others that move away from gravity. So that's an example of negative tropism, even though it's considered up. So you'll see that in a second. And again, auxin is involved in that phototropism, as we went over a bit ago. So here's an example of that phototropism. This is a positive form of tropism because the auxin, again, is weakening this side of the plant. So all of these portions right here on this side, okay, that's all getting weaker, okay, because of that auxin. This side staying firm and rigid so that it can then bend towards the light it needs. Now gravitropism is another one. This is the one where you have common things in a plant. So this plant was grown sideways. Typically the way a corn would grow is you'd have kind of the kernel looking like that, right? Normally the stem would go up, okay, and the roots would go down, okay. Well, this plant, this seed, was grown sideways, okay. And even though it was grown on its side, the shoot still grew up, just like it was supposed to. And the root still grew down like it was supposed to. So this is an example of the shoot growing up is negative tropism because it's growing away from gravity. So that's an important thing to understand. So that would mean away. Okay. Whereas the root growing down towards gravity, that's towards, so that ends up being positive tropism. Okay, so make sure you understand the differences between the two. So another one that's a little bit challenging for people to understand is photoperiodism. The idea is that depending on where a plant grows, they're used to a certain amount of day hours and night hours. If a plant doesn't get the right amount of hours, and again, we're all talking about this in flowering plants, so that's the big trick here. This is in flowering plants, okay? So if the plant does not get the right amount of light that it's supposed to, then it will not end up flowering like it's meant to be. So these tend to be plants differentiating because of the seasons of where they grow. So a short day plant, okay, number one here, okay, these plants, they grow when there's longer night hours. Okay, they have to have a shorter day, so what they do is that tells them that it's time to flower because it's usually a fall plant. Okay. Now a long day plant is looking for less night hours and more day hours. That's what we would call a summer or spring plant. Okay? And then you have day neutral ones where they really don't care so much about the hours of light. They're looking for other environmental stimuli. Maybe they're looking for a certain amount of light, a certain amount of water, or so on. But that's what they're looking for. They're looking for an environmental stimulus. Okay, and so they need to have typically what's called a critical length. Right? In other words, that means they're looking for a specific amount of darkness, not light. That's the big words down here in caps. Make sure you understand that. It's not so much how much light they're getting, or continuous light. It's about how much continuous dark. If they have a certain amount, a critical amount of continuous dark, then they'll choose to flower. So I'll show you that in the next slide. So here you've got a fall flower. These are your short day plants. These are the ones that will grow when the night hours are longer. So if you look at the numbers here, 8.5 hours is what this cocklebur on the left requires for the plant to actually grow its flower. Now, on the right, your spring flower, that's a clover plant. That one needs a shorter amount of hours. So in other words, less number of hours means it's going to, of night hours, that means it's going to flower. Now that does not mean that it's going to flower at night. It just means that the amount of night tells us when it's going to flower. There are some plants that flower at night. Typically, though, that's because of its pollinators, not because of its amount of hours. That's not preferable because of that. Now, how plants are able to detect light is this thing called phytochrome. Okay, phytochrome allows for plants to be able to detect the color of red. Okay, that red light. Okay, the red light tells them how much light there is and when it's happening. So that's not part of photosynthesis. So I don't want you to think that phytochrome is photosynthesizing. It's basically just a cell letting them know when is there sunlight available or if it's not. And again, if there's less hours of nighttime available, the spring plant will end up germinating its flowers. Whereas if there's more night flowers, then the fall plant will end up getting its flowers going. So we're going to go through these semi-quickly. We've gone through this in previous PowerPoints, so you can refer to those if you want more detail. But the idea is that you should know the terms here. Sporophyte, gametophyte, the 2N and the N. This is the focus, again, of alternation of generations. The idea is that it's a cycle, so let's go through those quickly. In the plant life cycle, you have mainly, and this is again in flowering plants. So when we're talking about this today, we're talking flowering plants. So that's the big deal. Now for flowering plants, the sporophyte is dominant and the gametophyte is going to be your not recessive, but your less dominant one. And so other terms to know for this are going to be microspore, okay, and megaspore. Basically, those are the fancy terms for saying the pollen grain or the sperm that gets produced. And then the megaspore is the female gametophyte or the embryo or the egg that gets formed. And so pollen can be moved by wind or by some sort of animal. It just depends on the type of plant, but usually pollen needs to be spread for this to happen. It doesn't just happen right next to the other plants. So the pollen ends up developing a tube. In that tube is when the sperm moves down. So you're going to see that in the diagram just a second. But the pollen itself is not the sperm. It needs a pollen tube. Okay? With the pollen tube, it's then able to move into the embryo and then fertilize the egg. Okay? But it's not only just fertilizing the egg. You're going to see in a bit, we have double fertilization, which is what we talked about in the last chapters. That's when we have a zygote being formed, as well as the endospore getting fertilized as well. Okay, and then again, you've got your new sporophyte, and it's the whole point of this is so that plants do not dry out. That's their big deal. Okay, plants have to deal with this, and if they don't, then they will dry out. So there's kind of the big picture again, and we'll go through those in short steps right now. But it starts off as your sporophyte. Okay, so your plant is your sporophyte. It is the full 2N version. It's got the anther, the ovary, and the ovule. So the ovule is the actual egg. The ovary is just the area for the egg being housed. Through meiosis, that's the big thing. A lot of people got that wrong on the previous test, but through meiosis, you end up with 2 haploid cells. Okay, the microspore is going to become your pollen, and the megaspore is going to become your egg. So through that, the pollen grain gets formed in the embryo sac. From there, they fertilize either the same plant or another, and then that zygote is now and it grows up into another plant, and finally through mitosis grows into a new flower so that you can start the process all over again. Now flowers tend to be unique because they are usually found, or they're only found in angiosperms. Okay, so when you hear the term angiosperm, you're talking about a flowering plant. They produce these spores. They basically protect the gametophyte to make sure that the egg ends up becoming the seed or the fruit that needs to be made. Okay, and the flower's main purpose is to aid in pollination and produce those seeds, or the fruits that enclose the seeds. So again, here are the main parts. We talked about this in the previous chapter. The sepals are the green portions on the bottom that tend to protect your plant. Your petals attract the pollinators. Some plants may have no petals at all if they're wind pollinated. Your stamens are the male part of the plants. That's the part with the anther, okay, and the filament. Okay, so when we say stamen, that means the whole male portion. The carpel is the whole female portion. That's 3 parts. She's got the stigma at the top where she gets the sticky pollen to attach. The style where the pollen tube goes, and then the ovary which houses the eggs. Okay. Many times this can be 1. This can also be multiple depending on how your plant grows. So here they are again, right? The petals, the sepals, which are the outsides, the receptacle, which holds the ovule and the ovary, the style where the pollen tube goes, the stigma at the top, and then the male portions, which are the anther and the filament. Now, what's interesting too is sometimes the stigma and the style can be longer than the anther and the stamen because it will prevent it from self-fertilizing. At this point, the anther from here can actually get in there and it can fertilize. That's not something all plants want. Some plants want to have genetic diversity. They don't want to just reproduce as quickly, so they end up repositioning those. And I'll show you the more extended version of that in just a second. So here's a monocot. See, it's got the 3 multiples, but still it has the carpel and the stamen. So the carpel is where that stigma style ovary is, and you notice how the carpel is smaller than the stamens. That means this is possible to self-fertilize. There's our dicot, okay, our eudicot. Carpel's in the center. Stamens are off to the side. This is probably to prevent them from self-fertilizing. And of course the petals to attract your pollinator. And again, not all the flowers have to have these parts. Some flowers are considered complete, where they have the sepal, okay, they have the petal, and they have the stamen, as well as a carpel. Some plants are incomplete and they only have certain parts. Those that are complete tend to be your bisexual flowers. They have both stamens and carpels. Some unisexual flowers can either have one or the other. Now, here's the interesting thing. The word monoecious, you think of just one, right? So think of this in terms of monoecious, meaning one plant, okay? Both male and female flowers on one plant. Dioecious means you have to have 2 plants. So you think of di thinking that, oh, it's got both, but di means that it's on separate plants. That's important. So let me show you what this one looks like. This plant right here is a monoecious plant. It is one plant, even though it's got both sexes. It's got the female flower over here, the one on the left. Okay, it's got the male flower right there on the right. Now, this plant is considered monoecious because it has both flowers, although these are not complete flowers, because they don't have both parts. So that's an important thing to understand. So make sure you get those clear in your head. A complete flower versus an incomplete flower. And then a monoecious plant versus a dioecious plant. Not one is better or worse than the other. It's just how their species evolve differently. Okay? And then, of course, how you get from spores to fertilization, that's what this one is. So this is a bit new and a little more detailed than the previous PowerPoints, so make sure you're paying attention to this part. So let's go through these step by step, but this is the big overview diagram so you can see what's going on here. The idea is that your pollen sac is the anther up at the top. It's going to release a pollen grain. Okay, that pollen grain is going to be 4 microspores that end up surviving. Okay, and through mitosis, it ends up making this big old grain. Now the grain then ends up attaching itself to the stigma of a plant. From here, it grows a pollen tube all the way through. See that tube right there as we go along the line? That pollen tube is what has the 2 sperm that go through. Now the female, she has 4 of these microspores that form through meiosis, but only 1 makes it. The others are reabsorbed, and then that 1 ends up dividing and dividing again and continuously dividing until it's got this embryo sac. Once that embryo sac is available and ready to fertilize, then it gets onto the anther. The sperm attaches and it goes down the tube and into the female ovary, and then from there the egg is formed. But it's not just the 1 sperm, you get double fertilization because the zygote is fertilized, but then so is the endosperm as well. And that's the part that ends up reproducing or becoming the part that pretty much feeds the seed throughout. So we'll go through that in more detail in just a bit. So once those end up developing, you've got your pollen tube. That's the 2 cells that get formed in the microspore. And then later, those end up becoming 2 sperm so that it can fertilize twice. And you'll see what that means in a bit. And then you have pollination, which is basically the transfer from pollen to the anther. And you can also have cross-pollination where you pollinate a different plant. So there's what pollen looks like, and it's all very unique to each plant. So they're not always the same, but each plant or plant type has a different form of pollen. So in the ovule, you've got those 4 megaspores. Again, 1 ends up becoming the actual female gametophyte, the egg, right? Whereas the others will end up kind of reabsorbed and end up being part of that endosperm later, okay? And so fertilization happens. The pollen grain has to get in there and produce a pollen tube. No pollen tube, no sperm, okay? And then those 2 sperm will fertilize. 1 forms a 2N zygote, okay? That's the big deal. So that's the one that becomes the seed. The other sperm will fuse with the 2 nuclei of the embryo, forming that 3N endosperm. That's a really big concept to understand. We talked about that briefly in the previous chapter, but it's important to understand why we have double fertilization. So in a eudicot, right, you've got 3 parts. You've got the seed coat, the endosperm, and the embryo. Now, the seed coat is the thing that's around the seed. Well, the endosperm ends up becoming food for the embryo and ends up being absorbed by the actual cotyledons. Remember those embryonic leaves? So that ends up absorbing the endosperm in a eudicot. And then it withers away when the leaves grow. Now the embryo itself is the other portion of the double fertilization. That's the thing that specializes, that becomes the plant shoots and roots. So that's the part that is the actual egg. So here's how this works, right? So this is after fertilization. Now we've got an endosperm and we've got the zygote. As we see them fertilized, they begin to grow together. In a dicot, you've got this preglobular stage where the endosperm starts to wrap itself around the zygote. Okay. Then we've got what's called the globular stage where the embryo is now undergoing a bunch of mitosis and becoming more and more complex, and the endosperm is still continuously wrapping around it. Then the embryo itself starts to form the 2 cotyledons in a eudicot. This is where we call it the heart-shaped stage because the 2 dicots end up looking a little bit like a heart. Now the endosperm is still there. it's basically completely wrapped around, but next what will happen is it's going to start getting absorbed by the rest of the embryo, and it's going to become a part of that cotyledon. So here we call it the torpedo stage. Okay, the torpedo stage is where the cotyledons start to bend and end up basically becoming a part of that endosperm. So they end up fusing together, and that ends up eventually going away. And now you've got your full-on seed with your two cotyledons and your seed coat around it. Now, this is different from a eudicot. From monocot, excuse me. So eudicot has two cotyledons, and they end up being absorbed into the cotyledons. The endosperm does. Now, the monocot only has one, and the endosperm is there, and it ends up being food storage throughout. So you'll see what that looks like in this next diagram. And so here's a different fruit type, so you can see what those look like. The seeds end up basically developing from those ovules, from that that egg in there, right? And you can have different parts. Once the egg is fertilized, the flower withers away, and that bottom portion becomes the fruit. Now, in dry fruit, those tend to be thin with really dry ovaries, not a lot of water. So that's your wheat, your rice, walnuts, and peas. Fleshy fruits can be different in those. So you can have your peach, your cherry, your olive. Those are what we call drupes. Okay, they are basically the ones that are what we call the stone fruit. So they've got these large seeds or pits inside. Then you've got berries where the seeds are inside. That would be like a tomato. Tomato is actually a berry. Then you have palms, which tend to be like a dry ovary. It's kind of a mix of the two. So the actual ovary that houses the seed is dry. That's the seed inside. But then it's got a fleshy part on the outside that was the endosperm. So that would be like an apple. So that's a palm. Now, how do the seeds get out to the rest of the world? Well, that's through dispersal. There needs to be some form of getting it out there. Most plants will use some sort of an animal to do this. Okay, they'll provide them with food in the fruit, and later what will happen is the animal will eat it. So here's a mockingbird eating a holly. Later, that mockingbird will likely poop it out through its feces, and it will have fertilizer as it goes. Now, squirrels themselves, they do the planting for the seeds or for the trees. They gather a lot of nuts and they bury them. A lot of the time, squirrels will forget to where their seeds were or their nuts, and they will end up planting the seed for them. So that is something that helps them, helps those trees in their dispersal. Others are not so nice. So this is a burdock, right? So you ever had a little thorn or spine attached to your shoelaces or your socks? This is a relative of that. And basically it attaches to fur or cloth, and it uses that to carry away. And then later when the animal scrapes it off or takes it off on its own, now it's able to move away from its parent. So it's still just, those are the seeds that you're carrying along when those are attached. Others don't need animals, they just use the wind. Okay, so a dandelion is an example of this, or maple. This type of little seed is called a samara. Okay, so it catches the wind and then it uses it kind of like in a helicopter blade to fly off with the wind. Now, seeds need to have certain conditions to be able to germinate. If they don't have those conditions, then they really won't be able to work. So some plants are picky. They need water, they need warmth or oxygen or moisture. Others need some sort of a trigger like a cold or a fire, or the fruit itself should be removed, and that will be enough. Okay. So for example, like if you buy a bag of beans from a store, those will not germinate in the plastic bag. They need to have water, they need to have soil, eventually light. So that's, and those can last as long as needed because of those cotyledons. So here is a dicot as it is going to germinate. It's got the seed coat on the inside or towards the outside. The embryo is that little segment up there at the top with the leaves, and the cotyledon is the portion with all of the energy. So that's stored away. So what happens is the shoot ends up coming out with the roots once it's got the right conditions. So let's show you what that looks like. The seed coat starts to shed after the roots come out and the shoot is happening. So the first true leaves then pop up. That's these over here. Okay, and it's called a dicot because it's got two of these cotyledons that will basically feed the plant while this is growing. So it's very immature and it's growing, and the two cotyledons will keep it alive. Eventually, the cotyledons will wither and fall off while the plant is now able to photosynthesize and do its own. So this is a dicot. Notice it's got many of the characteristics of a dicot. It's got that pinnate leaf structure, right, where it goes kind of outwards like that. And again, the dicot is the big giveaway here. So the two cotyledons. This is different from a monocot. So a monocot has to have that endosperm. It keeps it there. So that's that 3N segment. And so it's got its immature leaves covered by a sheath of the cotyledon. Okay, so the sheath is in there and the fruit is in there. And this is why we eat a lot of like corn and soy and stuff like that. Those plants tend to have a lot of energy in their seeds because of the endosperm. Okay, so the endosperm is the reason for that. So if you look at it right here, here's the way the corn grows. It grows normally up, okay, and down there. And then what happens is the first leaf pops out of the sheath and it is now able to grow as well as the roots, okay? And so it doesn't really use its cotyledon other than as a method of storage in here, okay? Then as this begins to grow, this starts to wither away, okay? And now our true leaves are coming, and notice it's got that parallel structure, right? So no longer the pinnate movements, but that parallel structure, okay? And so that's the difference between a monocot and a dicot germination. So some other things that plants can do is they do reproduce asexually, right? So besides the fact that they have to fertilize and undergo meiosis to make their sperm and egg, they still need to be able to grow on their own. So that happens because of the meristem, right? The meristem is that tissue that can become other tissues, okay? Now, strawberry plants, what we can do is we can take the nodes of the strawberry plant and use that to make more. So that would be basically you're making a clone of the plant using that. You can also take rhizomes from irises, and seedless plants are produced in many different ways, but basically you can do this without fertilization. So it's not always necessary, it just depends on the conditions of the plant. So here's one example. You can take this stolon, right, that portion of the plant, and take a node off of it, and from there you can grow an entirely new plant. It's clonal, but it's another whole plant. That's asexual, what we call propagation. So that's the term you're going to hear quite a bit. It's propagating a plant. And this can happen again with the rhizomes as well. So you can take that segment that grows in between the plants, and you can cut sections of it off, and it will grow new plants. Now what we've found is that it used to be that plants were just propagated and grown on their own, but now we have tissue cultures that we can grow. And plants tend to be this, and this is a big word to know, totipotent. Okay, totipotent means that each plant cell can become an entire plant. Given the right conditions, we can take these tissues, grow them in the proper media or hormone, and that will cause it to happen. Like I said, you can do this at home. If you take a leaf from a node, off of the node of a stem, you can then purchase root stimulant which has auxin in it, and the auxin will then allow the roots to grow from that node in the right water and temperature, and then you'll have a full plant that's a clone of the original one. Okay, bananas and asparagus are grown like this. They basically use the meristem and make clonal plants that all are the same as a traditional plant. So we don't have to use any viruses or other things to make this. It just works on its own. And then of course you can culture the anther where they're haploid cells, and you can put the right hormones in there that make it double. So now that haploid cell has become a diploid cell, and now it's a plant. So there are many ways to get around plant propagation. So here's what it looks like in tissue culture. They take this undifferentiated mass over here, this kind of globular stuff here. That's called a callus. And what they do from the callus, they can then develop the right organs. They can develop leaves, roots. They can make little plantlets, and they can be stored and shipped and then transferred into soil to become full plants later. So this is something we've been doing a lot with our farming and food techniques. So one way we've done this is through genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is an amazing thing because we've been able to, originally it was just about hybridizing plants. We wanted the right trait, so we would select those seeds, save them, and grow more of them, and then fertilize them with others that were similar to what we wanted. And so we were able to grow our plants the way we wanted them. Now we don't have to do that growth by plant. We can take the genes that we want and use a bacteria. This is one we use quite a bit. It's called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. Okay, this bacteria grows a plasmid. Okay, we make a plasmid of what we want. Remember, that's that circular DNA in the bacteria. Okay, so it grows a plasmid, and inside the plasmid, basically we get it to infect the plant, but it's not infecting it with a disease. It's infecting it with the DNA we want. So there's your typical bacteria, right? So it's got your rod shaped, and it's got its own DNA in this little jumble there. Okay. Now, once that little jumble is over, okay, it's got a little circular DNA. That circular DNA is the plasmid we want. It infects it, and that's what ends up making your trait that you want. You can also fire a pellet gun back into that callus from earlier in the slides, and those will end up producing your genetically modified plants, or what we call transgenic plants. Okay. And so we've done this with tons of different plants. We had over 72 million in early 2000s of plants that were transgenic, and the idea is that you want them to be either resistant to herbicides or pests. Okay, get those things to grow without any interference. We don't have to till the plant as much, which means we can avoid eroding the soil and using so much water. The problem is that native and wildlife plants will end up declining. So there are some downsides, but I don't want you to think there's downsides like you see in the movies or TV. You're not going to die from eating a genetically modified plant or food. What it's going to do is it's going to end up maybe transferring the genes to weeds, and that's going to be a bigger problem later. And then some people may have allergies to some of the things that we're adding to the plants or making them resistant to, and you could harm the environment with more pesticides. Okay, so that's a big deal. But other than that, your health is not going to be directly harmed. You're not going to end up getting sick, growing a third arm, or growing some sort of a weird mutation because of this. It's just going to be environmental damage that we have, or a sickness from the excess amount of pesticide. So as you can see, there are tons of benefits that we've been able to do, and we would not be able to feed the current number of 7.6 or 7.7 billion people on the planet if we did not have genetically modified plants. And every plant you've eaten in your life probably is some sort of a genetically modified organism. For example, bananas, wheat, strawberries, those are modified before we had the capability of genetically modifying. We did that through selective breeding, but now they're modified genetically, and you're not dying from them. They're just a different form of plant, kind of man-made almost. So that was the whole PowerPoint. Hopefully you got something out of that.